This week on Just Solutions. In 2018, the Camp Fire, the deadliest wildfire in California history, levelled the entire town of Paradise. Nearly 19,000 buildings, mostly homes, were destroyed. The Poor People's Campaign and the California Homeless Union together supported the newly homeless residents. 3 years later, in the midst of yet another devastating wildfire season, what's happened in Paradise and the surrounding communities? Our guests are Anthony Prince, General Counsel for the California Homeless Union, and Greg Shafer, originally from Paradise. He works as a mental health counsellor and he advocates for those made homeless by the fire. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Anthony and Greg, it's great to have you with us on Free Speech TV. Some of the clips that we have just seen there are from a documentary that you were both involved in, a Free Speech TV production called From These Ashes. Anthony, you were one of the producers, and Greg, you were the narrator. You were almost the guide through Paradise because you're from Paradise, but you work with the Poor People's Campaign and also as a mental health advocate, working with people experiencing homelessness. Now, obviously, the wildfire, that is many shows in and of itself. We could dig into the wildfires, but today we're going to focus on homelessness and the intersection between homelessness and the wildfires. And both of you were involved in that. As I said, From These Ashes digs into some of that. We're now in 2021. How are things with the homeless community right now in Paradise? I'll start with you, Greg. Did things really become worse because of the wildfire back in 2018? How are things today in 2021?
Well, I can't say that they're better. In Chico and Oroville and Paradise and the surrounding communities here in Butte County where I work, homelessness issues continue to just be this kind of intractable battle. And as more people are made homeless by various fires since the Camp Fire, you know, we sort of anticipated when the Camp Fire happened. I think most people had this sense that, okay, this is a once in a lifetime event. This town burned down and now that's behind us and we can rebuild and do something different moving forward. And then since then, we've had these progressively terrifying fire seasons. We had the Berry Creek fire last year or the year before that. And then right now, we've got the Dixie Fire, which is this just incredibly large wildfire to our north. And outside my window right now, the smoke and the air quality is in the dangerous category. It's actually cold and dark outside because of the smoke, which is very similar to how the Camp Fire was. And in terms of our response to the housing crisis here and how the wildfires have impacted housing and homelessness, we don't have anything to point to that we can say, here's a clear solution that has been attempted to be put forward. I mean, there's several different options that have been tried since the Camp Fire by homeless advocates that have just been basically stonewalled or delayed out of feasibility or have had funding pulled since the Camp Fire. It's really disheartening. It's something that Butte County residents recognize as this severe problem that's simply not going to go away. And yet, despite the best efforts of many well-intentioned people, we can't seem to find a way to simply house folks, especially poor folks or the mentally ill. It's bleak, you know. It's not a great situation here, and it's not just here in Butte County or in Paradise or Chico, but all across the state, as I'm sure Anthony will tell us about. But yeah, it's not a great scene.
Well, Anthony, you're with the California Homeless Union, and you have been working with folks dealing with homelessness for many years. When people talk about wildfires and think about the impact of wildfires, I think those who are already unhoused, it probably doesn't even enter their mind. I mean, the focus is often on people who are losing stuff in the fire, the devastation. But for people who are already so vulnerable and so marginalized, when a wildfire impacts them as well, it can be exponentially worse. You know, take us through what you see as the impact on the wildfires, whether it's the Camp Fire, currently the Dixie Fire, or really name any fire because there are fires constantly these days. What are the impact of those fires on the homeless?
Well, I think the impact of these wildfires, certainly in the Camp Fire, which was in Paradise, are they take a lot of different forms. And I think to begin with, those who are actually in tents or hidden away in certain rural areas, they continue to suffer from just very serious health issues. It's been determined that the Paradise Fire, because it was a small town, but is also surrounded by the foothills and all the kind of more wooded areas, was both an urban fire and a rural fire. And the number of toxins that came into the atmosphere, in some cases carcinogens, in some cases poisonous materials that are already evidence is showing that people have been permanently impacted and made sick. So those who had no shelter, no indoor place to have refuge, they were arguably put at immediate risk with just inhaling the smoke and all the chemicals that were released by the campfire. It was an extremely intense fire. You'll see in the documentary where Greg and I are looking at the melted hubcaps, melted steel. Steel melts at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you can imagine the health effects. I think the wildfires are aggregating, as you say, an already existing status quo where the homeless are just more vulnerable to, on every possible threat you can imagine. Their vulnerability is increased. COVID-19, the impact of fires, people who had a few meager possessions, no insurance, no way to recover these items. You can see that it had a disproportionate impact. But I think also, I have to say, because I think this is in some ways the most significant aspect, and that's why the film is called From These Ashes, A New Movement is Rising, is that I think we saw a determination on the part of many members of the homeless community to organize and stand up for themselves in the wake of the fires. And we were able to establish a real foothold in Northern California, we, the California Homeless Union, in large part because of what Greg Shafer was able to do for us in kind of representing he was a victim, his family was a victim of the fire, and yet he also was, you might say, an average guy, working class guy. His parents, his dad's a truck driver, his mom worked for the school district, and as he says, it could happen to anybody. So we've learned those lessons. We've learned those lessons and applied them in building our local unions in the Northern California part of the state. So I think there's hope, but there is absolutely devastation and continuing, harms that are impacting a rapidly expanding population of unstably housed and homeless people in California.
We'll talk about some of those solutions maybe, or a piece of progress that are emerging or that can be built off in just a moment. But, the latest United Nations report, the IPCC report on the climate crisis, red alert for humanity, indicates we're only going to have more of these fires. And so there's a lot of discussion in communities that are vulnerable to wildfires about making communities resilient. How do we strengthen community networks? If we are rebuilding, how do we rebuild in a way that can help us through these disasters? Do either of you see homeless people or people who are already vulnerable and marginalized, maybe people living in temporary housing, being considered when we're talking about rebuilding communities or making communities resilient in the face, say, of increased wildfires because of the climate crisis? Are the homeless being considered in those plans at all?
Mm.
Greg, we'll go with you.
Well, I mean, the homeless are not really considered now, and I think generally in times of crisis, people, are concerned with protecting their own first. So I do not consider homeless people to be a priority in the minds of a lot of our forward-thinking, developers. But I'd also say, I think people are just trying to grapple one season to the next. I don't even think there's much talk about the foresight that's going to be required to meet these things kind of head on. I mean, we're trying to deal with PG&Es being held accountable for this fire from 3 years ago, and that's not been a successful endeavor for many. Most folks don't feel satisfied with the outcomes that are coming out of the lawsuits with PG&E and the restructuring of that organization. And so I think, we haven't even had time to properly address the Camp Fire. Since then, we had COVID-19, we had the Berry Creek Fire, we had the Dixie Fire. I feel like for the average person, at least, it's been such an onslaught of disaster upon disaster that people are not able to really plan 10 years ahead. And I think this is very common for people experiencing homelessness as well. We want people to, I don't know, make a plan for themselves, for their families, for their lives, or like work towards a career, or, I think if folks who aren't interacting with the homeless very much expect them to have these plans where they can move forward with their lives. And they're more concerned about, how do I protect my stuff from getting stolen today so that I can go to a job interview or get a haircut or get the food that I need for today. It's being able to have that foresight about community planning and building resilience is kind of a privilege and a luxury that you don't have if you don't have a place to lock your stuff away at night or take a shower, So unfortunately, I feel like these basic needs should be at the forefront of community planning and building resilience, because someone's going to be a lot more effective if they have a sink where they can wash their face in the morning, or get a drink of water. They're going to be able to contribute a lot more to building these solutions if they can get their basic needs met right away. But I mean, that's not the way that decision makers are thinking about this. It's not focusing on helping. I like to think that, homelessness and people who are homeless tend to be thought of by developers and by city councils as a liability to the town and a danger and a threat. But these are human beings. They're incredibly tenacious and smart and have a wealth and a variety of skill sets that they can apply if they had the environment necessary to get their basic needs met. This is a possible resource, right, for stronger and more resilient communities if we prioritize helping people get what they need to participate in society and civilized life in a more organized way. So, there's a lot of research being done about the cost of homelessness to society, right? And it ends up being cheaper to build people homes than to allow people to continue to be homeless, because homeless folks tend to consume more emergency services, for example, right? So we kind of have this sort of backwards approach to dealing with homelessness as like an afterthought, get these people out of our towns, rather than if we gave them what they need to thrive and survive as our neighbors, which they are, and they have a right to be here just like the rest of us, then they're going to find ways to contribute, because that's the way, human beings like to act. We love to participate in our communities and contribute to making the world a better place around us. But first we have to get our own house in order. And you can't do that if you don't have a house. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but I don't think there's been enough consideration about helping homeless people meet their basic needs so they contribute to building more resilient communities.
Well, Anthony, I'd like your thoughts on that. And just, Greg, you raise an excellent point that's actually addressed in the documentary From These Ashes, that communities need to look at the homeless community as an asset. There are so many resources, actually. And in the aftermath of the 2018 fire, the Camp Fire, members of the Homeless Union, members of the Poor People's Campaign, folks who were homeless themselves, showed up to help, to say, we understand what it's like to not have a home. We know how to help you. And instead of looking after themselves, they came out to help the community. So could you talk a little bit about that, Anthony, and then also how they were then treated? And we'll dig into this because it's also part of the documentary From These Ashes, that they were actually segregated in many ways from the services that were being provided to everybody who was homeless in the aftermath of the fire. But take us through that these folks showed up to help those who lost everything, people who themselves had very little.
Yes. Well, we had just a relatively short time before the Camp Fire had established one of our new homeless union locals in the city of Marysville, California, and in Yuba County, which is also part of what they call gold country. A lot of these small towns, Marysville, they have a big sign you come into the town. There's only 12,000 people. 3,000 of which live at or below the poverty line. Big sign, welcome to gold country. And a lot of these other small towns in the mountainous areas were gold mine towns. In fact, Pacific Gas and Electric, which Greg was talking about, PG&E, was actually created to assist in gold mining. That was the original purpose. And now they're criminals. They were actually convicted in a fire that happened in the southern part of the San Francisco Bay Area by a jury because they had committed fraud with regard to the safety issues. And they accept responsibility, and yet there's no sanction, and they continue to operate and make millions of dollars. And I don't understand how that can be allowed to happen, but it does happen. So the consideration, to the extent there are considerations, it seems to me that they're going towards these monopolies and going towards these developers and going towards these, many cases, completely out of town business interests who swoop in kind of like vultures, and they see these devastated communities, and what they see is dollar signs. They see an opportunity to make millions, to invest where they can get the highest return on their investment. So, they're not considering. In fact, the only I think that they're rebuilding to the extent that's happening at the expense of the homeless. And we're seeing all across the state of California now an increasingly and very rapidly intensifying drive towards not just clearing the homeless out, but to the extent that they can't stop the constant increase in the number of unhoused persons, we see now the increasing forced internment of homeless people. The city of Sacramento just passed a measure, the Sacramento City Council, to spend $100 million. They have about 11,000 homeless people in Sacramento. Our union represents about 2,500 of them. And they want to take the $100 million and they're going to build these mass congregant shelters, or what they call safe parking, or what they call safe ground. And no actual housing is going to be constructed. Not a single house is going to be constructed with that $100 million. And we did the math. And if you divide $100 million by the cost of a modular home, which could be $35,000 and house 5 people, every single one of those 11,000 people could have a house, permanent, durable, a place to live as a human being and not an inmate. Some of these so-called shelters, they have barbed wire fences. Your rights are taken from you. You can't have visitors. You're under a curfew. They don't even want you to leave. They bring things in instead of permitting the residents of these shelters to travel about town. You're subject to searches without any probable cause. There is no due process. If for some reason you are accused of an infraction of the rules and are kicked out of these homeless shelters. We call it the homeless industrial complex. They're making money off the homeless. So they don't really have an interest in eliminating homelessness because they're profiting by it. And so that's why we created the homeless union, so that the homeless themselves can actually organize and take their own fate, their own lives into their hands. And we advocate, but we're not advocates because we're the actual organized homeless. 75% of our members and officers are on the streets, in the shelters, in the encampments, sleeping in the cars, some cases sleeping in school corridors, doubling, tripling up with other families. As Greg says in the documentary, anybody can become homeless. I think we learned that from COVID. We learned that from these fires. So it's time for Californians to look at it differently. And I think they are looking at it differently. And we're building our union on the basis of this, increased understanding out there and people thinking of the homeless in a different way. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but we think there's a real opportunity here to build what we think would be an historic movement in California.
But you were talking there about, how so many people are now finding themselves in this situation due to the fires, due to COVID, and yet very often they're treated in a different way. In the documentary From These Ashes, they touch on that the folks who were already unhoused, people already experiencing homelessness, were treated differently from those who were newly made homeless. And I think when folks from Paradise ended up in Chico, they were treated differently as well. Anthony, could you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, well, just very briefly, first of all, to go back just a moment, what we did, I had mentioned that we had just started a new local chapter in Marysville, which is a very short distance from Paradise. And so it was the members of our union down there, and they had all been kicked out of encampments 2 years before. They gathered what few possessions they had and went up to this giant vacant space right next to the Walmart, and were distributing what little they had, clothing, sleeping bags, toys. These were homeless children who living on a river bottom, who said, "Oh, well, they can take my teddy bear." I mean, it's beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. But we went up there and we brought direct support, what we call Project Survival, but we also brought organization. And that's why, we were immediately confronted when we got to that big campground by Walmart, by some of the more official support organizations who challenged us, but they had to back off when they saw how well received we were by the people that had been made homeless. And in Chico, like we say, they actually set up at the Red Cross at the old fairgrounds, the Silver Dollar Fairgrounds in Chico. They had those made homeless by the fire indoors, and those who had been homeless in some cases for years in the city of Chico outdoors. And so just to maintain that division, it's always about divide and conquer. It's always about setting one group against another group. And so, but homelessness is the great unifier. You go into the camps and you go into the shelters and you're going to see a cross section of America, and they've lost everything. It's hard to say that, hey, I'm superior to you, or I feel inferior to you, or I'm superior to this other guy, when you're living on a river bottom, when you're living in a cardboard box or a tent. You know what I'm trying to say? So the objective circumstances of having lost everything are bringing people together across color lines, across, gender lines, faith lines. And so that's the hope of our movement, is that we think we're at the cutting edge of a broad movement against poverty.
Well, Greg, how many people were actually made homeless in Paradise because of the campfire? John, who's watching on Facebook, asked then, of those, how many are actually still experiencing homelessness?
Well, I'm not sure on the exact numbers of this. The town, I read that about 50,000 people were displaced immediately after the fire. And, it's really very tricky to figure out where all those people went, because many folks just went wherever they had family that would take them in. So, that's, Anthony found a cool website around those days when you could see where campfire people had been scattered to every state in the Union. They were all across the United States, and it was kind of a diaspora. People were just sent elsewhere, and many of them never came back or never had the opportunity or the reason to return. So it was sort of from working here, it was just very strange, because I had people in my life that were there one day and then were gone the next, and never heard from them, never came back again. So I don't know the exact numbers of people who remain homeless now since the fire, but you don't just lose 50,000 homeless housing units in a day and not build any new ones and have things work out. We already had a low-income housing crisis before the fire, and the developmental regulations in and around Chico and Butte County tend to prioritize the development of larger housing units, like 3-bedroom apartment complexes, for example, or 3-bedroom homes, larger family units, which aren't conducive to homeless folks who tend to not be able to sustain those small family units for a long time. So, and there's also problems with like rental agreements. For example, in Chico, one of the main renters in the town requires that someone provide proof of income that is greater than 3 times their average rent before they'll rent an apartment to you, right? So it's just not feasible for someone who's on, let's say, Social Security income or disability. It just can't be done. So not only is there this massive drop in housing units after that particular fire, not to mention like the Berry Creek fire, which I want to kind of bring up because that happened in 2020. And it was in the middle of COVID. And so I went to work at an evacuation shelter here in Butte County, and I was meeting people who, like me and like other campfire folks, had been burnt out. And because of COVID, the county and the state were way more resistant to providing any kind of support for those folks too. It was a smaller community, but there was so much fear around contracting. And, it was a difficult situation for public health to manage as well. But you get these like cascading catastrophes that you have low income already, which was making it hard for people to survive. Then you have the Berry Creek fire, and you have COVID on top of that, and it just becomes too much for people to manage, right? So anyway, sorry, I drifted a bit. Your question was about how many people were made homeless from the fire. I can't say. It was in the order of thousands, tens of thousands.
Well, how many people, what in terms of the rebuilding effort, you said there that there's often a focus on higher income housing, or less of a focus maybe on lower income housing. And so in the rebuilding efforts, has that played out in these communities that were devastated?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only people who are rebuilding are people who can afford to rebuild. And those folks were typically homeowners who had insurance and whose insurance companies didn't bankrupt. My neighbors up in Paradise, they lost their home in the fire, and their insurance company, because they had a smaller insurance company, went bankrupt. And so they weren't paid out. So they just lost money, their dream of a home, it was just gone. And these were professionals, an professional arborist and a school teacher, right? These were, hardworking, college-educated, middle-class young people who are suddenly homeless, So the people who can rebuild are folks who typically had homeowners insurance and also the will to go back, right? So a lot of folks, my parents, for example, didn't move back to Paradise because it's dramatic, Imagine, like I was talking about my friend who's a professional IT provider. He rebuilt his new home. It's a nice home. But now it's every summer they're living under the shadow of threat of like, we could go through it all again. It could take years for us to rebuild, and so it takes some fortitude to want to go back and rebuild. And a lot of folks have not done that. And so this is just a very narrow sliver of homeowners, right? If you were a renter, you're out of luck, right? Even if you had renter's insurance, of course, there's not, people don't rent in Paradise anymore. It's just not an option, obviously. So all those folks who are working middle-class incomes and saving up maybe to buy a home, who are renting a place, they're out of luck. They have to go someplace else. So, and it's not like there's one central authority that's organizing housing development in Paradise, right? There are several different companies that are working at this, and lots of different groups that are advocating for their own interests and organizing themselves as well. So it's kind of hard to like say this is one entity's responsibility to make sure that there's enough low-income housing. But you could say that's the state government's responsibility, and they haven't delivered on that. So in terms of low-income housing, yeah, it's not addressing the demand, pure and simple.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time for this interview, but I encourage people to watch the documentary From These Ashes. Anthony Prince was one of the producers. He's featured in the film, as is Greg, who's originally from Paradise. Catch it on Free Speech TV. Catch it online at freespeech.org. There's so much in that, and I so appreciate you both joining us today to give us some updates. And we just have 5 seconds, but Anthony, people can engage with the California Homeless Union how, and find out more about your organizing efforts?
Well, actually, at this point, the best way to engage is go to we have so many different websites, our local unions, but the one that's probably best is our national. We're part of a national union of the homeless, and that's NUH 2020 at I believe at gmail.com. I should have it right in front of me, but I don't. But I would say that they could also contact me directly, and that's at Prince Law Offices, all one word, PRINCELAW OFFICES at Yahoo. And I'll route them to the union officials they need to connect with.
There's also usually a local Facebook page as well. So
Chico, yeah, that's right. There's Chico Homeless United has I think that's also at gmail.com. I'm not certain, and I apologize for not having all that information right available to you. There's also a website listed or an email address on the film at the end of the documentary. They can also go there and get information.
And that documentary, once again, is From These Ashes. Well, Greg and Anthony, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And do stay tuned for From These Ashes and for more Just Solutions. Join us next week, and we'll have further conversations. Next week, we'll be talking to the filmmakers behind a new documentary we'll be premiering, When Justice Isn't Just, taking a look at racism in our criminal justice system. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.